What's going on, everybody? I'm Johnny Brook. Welcome back to another Crafted Workshop video. Today I've got two guests in the shop. I've got Mike from Modern Builds. What's going on, man?
Not much. I'm excited.
And I've got Cressel from Maker Size. How you doing?
Great, man.
So we're pretty pumped up. We've got this pretty cool project planned for you guys. Something none of us have ever tried before, so there's a high potential for failure for sure. But we're gonna try to pour molten aluminum into a live edge slab into the voids and fill it with aluminum. I think it's gonna look sweet, but there is, as I said, a very high potential for failure. Let's go ahead and get started.
All right, do it.
First, let's rewind a bit in this story. So after Workbench Con was over a couple weeks ago, Mike from Modern Builds rode back with me to Asheville to do a collab. And we were thinking of ideas for a project, and I'd been kicking around the idea of pouring molten aluminum into a piece of wood for a while now. And since Cressel from Maker Size lives just down the road from me and is set up for aluminum casting, we figured this would be the perfect opportunity to experiment with this. So we headed over to Asheville Hardware, my local slab dealer, and picked up one of their more gnarly slabs, this piece of red oak with these huge voids. We figured this would make for the perfect piece to try out our aluminum casting experiment. Also, before we go any further, I want to give a quick shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video, and there'll be more on them towards the end of this video, so stay tuned for that. Back at my shop, I prepped the slab for casting, first removing all of the loose bark, and it looks like bug damage killed this tree and the bark was just hanging on by a thread, so it had to go. Next, I cut the slab to length, about 50 inches long, using my track saw. We figured the offcut would actually make the perfect test piece, so we prepped it for our first pour. I added some screws to the inside of the void, thinking that this would help give the aluminum something to kind of grab onto, but we actually forgot to do this on the actual slab, and it didn't seem to make much of a difference, so I don't know that this was actually necessary. Next, Mike added some modeling clay to kind of act as a gasket around the void. We were going to be pouring the aluminum into the slab with the slab face down and using a metal plate to keep the aluminum in place, so the modeling clay allowed the plate to seal nicely against the wood. Mike and I had picked up some scrap aluminum at my local metal scrapyard, and before it could be melted in the forge, I needed to cut it into some more manageable chunks that would fit into the crucible. Next, we slowly added the pieces to the foundry, allowing them to preheat on the top of the foundry before dropping them into the crucible. And this is a homemade setup that Cressel built himself using common parts available at pretty much any hardware store, and he has a lot more info on this setup on his channel, which I'll link to in the cards. Finally, it was time for the moment of truth, the first pour, and man was it satisfying. That said, the first thing we noticed was that the aluminum was definitely leaking, and we figured that this was because the plate had warped due to the high heat from the aluminum. We let the first layer cool down just for a couple seconds just to kind of plug the hole, and then continued to fill it with more aluminum. We also experimented with filling some of the bug holes and cracks with aluminum, but it was just too thick to flow into these holes and just kind of sat on the surface of the slab and caught it on fire. After flipping the slab over, we saw where all that extra aluminum had built up on the surface, which meant there was a lot of cleanup to do with the angle grinder, and the piece of aluminum was still so hot between it just being hot off of the foundry and also getting heated up by the angle grinder that it was actually burning the wood, which you can see here. But after cleaning it up, I was really happy with the look, and we figured we knew what we needed to change for the main pour, so we moved on to the main event, pouring it into the other part of the slab. So we prepped the slab with more clay and added the thicker metal plate, and had what now seems to be a tradition with collabs, another ghost moment. So when moving the slab over to the area for pouring, the plate actually fell off since it was so heavy, so we clamped it into place before pouring. The second pour went much better. We poured a little bit at a time to help seal the area, and it held in place really nicely. And this process was just so fun to watch. The molten aluminum, the slab catching on fire, it was just awesome. After the pour, we extinguished the fire by throwing some sand on it and then sprayed water onto the aluminum to cool it down quickly. If the aluminum is left at its kind of close to molten temperature, it'll just continue to burn out the wood and will become really loose in the void. After cooling the piece down, we moved it to a better lit area and removed the metal plate, and were met with an awesome looking piece. The clay kept everything in place, and the aluminum was only about 1/8 of an inch above the surface of the slab, so there wasn't a ridiculous amount of cleanup. Now, there was another void in the slab, but this one didn't go all the way through, so we prepped the top of the slab with more clay and poured some more aluminum. This one didn't go as well. We actually had a big air bubble in the pour, and it was also above the surface of the slab about 3/4 of an inch, so there was a ton more cleanup to do on that one, but it still ended up looking pretty nice. After pouring, we needed to remove that excess aluminum, and we're brainstorming ideas for flattening these aluminum pieces without heating them up too much, and came up with the idea to use a router flattening jig. Aluminum is soft enough where standard woodworking tools will actually cut it just fine, and I could keep the piece of aluminum cool between passes by blasting it with compressed air. I created a quick little base for my trim router using some scrap pieces of plywood and got to flattening. I started flattening with just safety glasses on, but quickly realized that a face shield was a very good idea along with my welding jacket. The pieces of aluminum coming off the router bit were super hot, and I've got a good number of burn marks on my arm from these little pieces landing there, and one even actually went through my shirt and burned the crap out of my stomach. So I definitely recommend wearing full safety gear if you're going to flatten your aluminum this way. While flattening, I also realized that the aluminum pieces were still a little loose in the slab just from the wood burning out, so I stabilized them with some CA glue, and this really helped with the routing process. I was getting some vibration and the bit was catching a good bit, and stabilizing the piece of aluminum totally solved this problem. I just continued flattening until I had both pieces roughly flush with the surface of the slab, and this was a really slow process. The aluminum heated up way too much if I tried to make deeper passes, so it was best to just take my time here. After getting the pieces roughly flat with the router, I pulled out the belt sander just to smooth everything out a little further, and I made sure to alternate between the two pieces of aluminum just to keep it from heating up too much. After flattening the aluminum sections, I needed to fill the rest of the voids and bug holes in the slab, and I decided to use epoxy for this. Before pouring the epoxy, I needed to dam up the bottom side of the slab to keep it from leaking out, and I found that this aluminum foil tape works really well for this. I also used more of the modeling clay to fill some of the larger voids on the underside of the slab, just so I wouldn't have to waste a bunch of expensive epoxy filling these voids that nobody will ever see. Before pouring the epoxy, I made sure to blow out the bug holes and made sure there wasn't any leftover pieces of clay hanging around, and then I could get to pouring. I used West System epoxy for this, using the 105 resin and 206 hardener to give myself plenty of open time during the pouring process. I also mixed in some TransTint brown mahogany dye to give the epoxy a little bit of color, since I thought it would blend nicely with the color of the slab. And this slab was ridiculously thirsty. Every pour felt like I was mixing way too much epoxy when in reality I had a lot more to add. In total, I think I used about a quart of resin on this slab, which is about $80 worth of epoxy. It just kept drinking it up and nothing was leaking on the underside of the slab, so I just kept adding it. On the last few pours, I decided to add some of the aluminum shavings left over from the routing process just to provide some more visual interest to the top of the slab. And I think these little shavings really ended up making the look of the table. I'm so glad I added these. After pouring the last little bit of epoxy, I needed to let it cure for about 12 hours and then I could get to flattening it.
All right, so we let the epoxy dry overnight. It's looking good, it's well cured, so now we've got to remove all of this excess epoxy from the surface here. And I think probably one of the fastest ways to do that is going to be a belt sander. And one quick tip, if you're using a belt sander, try and hook it up to some sort of shopback or dust extractor, because that's going to help keep this sanding pad cleaner, it's going to help keep the heat down, and it's just a lot better for you. All right, this is going to take a little while, so let's go ahead and get to it.
While I'm sanding the epoxy, let's take a second to talk about the sponsor of this week's video, Squarespace. I've personally been using Squarespace for my website for about a year now, and I love it. Squarespace offers beautiful, award-winning templates, and their all-in-one platform makes it super easy to make your next move with Squarespace. There's nothing to install, update, or patch like some other web platforms, and their 24/7 customer support makes it super easy to get help if you need it. To make your next move with Squarespace, go to squarespace.com/craftedworkshop to get a free trial and 10% off your first purchase. Thanks again to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. After sanding the epoxy flush, I noticed some small holes that didn't quite get filled, so I added a little more epoxy just to touch them up. And I actually had to do this a couple of times, and this really extended the time that it took to get this table finished up. Next, I went ahead and removed the foil tape and clay from the bottom of the slab and got it cleaned up too. Once the top was sanded flush, I could go ahead and cut it to length before giving it a final sanding. I sanded the live edge to remove any debris and get it cleaned up, and sanded all the edges and sides up to 180 grit. I sanded the top up to 320 grit to remove any of the fine scratches from the epoxy and get everything nice and smooth. Finally, it was time for the moment that I'd really been waiting for, applying that first coat of finish, and man, it did not disappoint. The slab really came to life, the epoxy was crystal clear, and the aluminum looked awesome. For the finish on this table, I went with Waterlocks, one of my favorite finishes for this type of project, and it really made that oak pop. After wiping on a few coats and letting it dry thoroughly, I decided to buff out the finish just to help even things out on the aluminum and the wood, and I used paste wax and synthetic steel wool to do this. It really smoothed everything out and gave the piece a perfect matte finish. Finally, I could add the hairpin legs that Mike and I worked on for his video while he was here, which you should definitely go check out. Unfortunately, Mike had to head back home before we could finish up this table, but we had a ton of fun while he was here. We gave a lot of behind the scenes sneak peeks on our Instagram accounts while he was here, so definitely go follow us there in case you missed those, at Modern Builds for Mike and at Crafted Workshop for me. To attach the legs, I used a few 1¼ inch panhead screws, making sure to pre-drill the holes to prevent splitting the slab. With the legs attached, the table was finally done.
Alright, hopefully you guys enjoyed this one. This table was a lot of work and was really just an experiment, but I'm pretty happy with the way it came out. I think the aluminum looks really cool. It's just a totally unique looking table, and honestly, the aluminum casting was just a ton of fun. I definitely want to get a foundry setup of my own so I can experiment more with this process. It's pretty cheap to get into, and I think the results are awesome. So thanks again to Mike from Modern Builds and Kressel from Maker Size for coming out and helping with this project. If you guys don't already subscribe to them, definitely go check them out. Also, if you don't subscribe to me, go ahead and do that. I put out new project videos like this pretty much every week. Also, ring that little notification bell so you're notified every time I put out a video. Also, I'll have a list of all the tools and materials I use down in the video description below. And last, I want to say a big thanks to the sponsors of this week's video, Squarespace and Waterlocks. All right, thanks again for watching, y'all, and until next time, happy building.